Hello, Mr. Hammond's class. I believe we will finally finish the book Scavenger today. Chapter 39. Fog cloaked the three figures standing under the glow of the lamppost. "Hand it over," Mr. Remora said, extending his hand. Barry and Clyde stood behind him. Matthew groaned. "You guys again?" Emily hugged the bag manuscript. "How did you find us?" James asked. "You didn't think you fooled me, did you? Hiding on a tour bus? I knew you must be near the end of the Griswold game, or you wouldn't have shown up at my house, so desperate to get your hands on the gold bug. It was only a matter of time before you led me to the manuscript." He flexed his extended hand in a gimme motion. "How did you know about it anyways?" Emily asked. She scanned the park for an escape route. An iron fence enclosed the area. There was an opening to the street not far away, but the question was whether they could outrun Mr. Remora and his goons for the second time that night. Mr. Griswold's letter said nobody knew about it. "Who do you think authenticated the manuscript?" Mr. Remora said. He shoved both hands deep into his pockets, pulling his jacket closed against the misty night. "I've worked for that man for a long time. I deduced his connection to Rufus Griswold within my first year of working for him. And he didn't find the lost Poe manuscript. I did. But there's no credit to me in that charming letter of his, is there?" "Of course not. We should have been partners, a 50-50 split. He never would have known what he had under his own nose if it hadn't been for me." Mr. Remora paced in front of Barry and Clyde, his hands out of his pockets now, flinging in all directions as he talked. "Then Griswold planned the cockamamie game without consulting me. You know what he said when I called him on it?" Mr. Remora jabbed a finger at Matthew like he expected him to respond. Matthew shook his head and stepped back. He said, "Oh, but you will be a partner, Leon. All you have to do is play the game and win." And he laughed. Emily frowned. Mr. Griswold wouldn't have been that mean. When he told me his idiotic plan to give the manuscript away as a prize, like it was a honey-baked ham or plastic trophy, I was horrified. That work deserves to be in a museum, not buried in the ground like a bone, free for any dog that digs it up. "Mr. Griswold agrees with you. He says so in his letter," Emily insists. "Ha!" Mr. Romero barked. "If he agreed with me, then it wouldn't be in your greasy hands right now. You're probably getting peanut butter all over it." "It's wrapped in plastic," Matthew said. "And my hands are clean," Emily added. "You'll cut it up for paper dolls." Mr. Remora waved his arms, strands of his hair flopping erratically. "Hey, now, Uncle Leon," Barry said. Mr. Romero whipped a finger towards him. "You don't get to say a say in this. I trusted you with entirely too much. This child has been more resourceful than you, Barry. You're worthless. You lose money that's not yours on horse races. I'm bailing you out with bookies left and right, and then I ask you to take care of one simple thing, and you screw it up, too." His shrill voice rang in the night. Emily's eyes flickered from Mr. Romero to the fog-shrouded park in hopes of spotting someone coming to see what the noise was all about. Barry shifted from side to side, eyeing Mr. Romero. Clyde yawned. Garrison Griswold was a fraud. He touted a deep love and respect for literature. But did you know he once used a first edition Dashiell Hammond as a coaster? A coaster! Emily took a step back, tripping on the metal box and stumbling into the hole they dug. She fell on her bottom, the manuscript clutched to her stomach. Her sudden movements alarmed Mr. Romero, and he shouted, "Don't move!" The next thing Emily knew, Clyde pulled a gun out of his pocket and pointed it at them. "Dude, I thought you threw it away," Barry cried. "I told you that to get you off my back," Clyde sneered. "You think I want to wash up and connect me with Griswold's shooting?" From where she sat on the ground, Emily said, "You shot Mr. Griswold?" All this time she never questioned that it had been a random mugging in the BART station. She thought of how many times she refreshed the book Scavenger forum for news on how Mr. Griswold was doing, how worried she had been that he wouldn't recover. And she wasn't the only one who had been affected by such a thoughtless, violent act. The mounds of flowers and books and stuffed animals left in tribute to him around the city were proof of that. The presence of Clyde's gun should have terrified her, but a wave of grief swelled over for Mr. Griswold's current uncertain state, followed by a tsunami of anger. "You shot him over a book? How could you do that? He did nothing but positive things. He might die now, and for what? How could you be that shallow and mean?" The fury raised in Emily propelled her up from the ground and forward. With every step and every word, the three men shrank back as a group, though Clyde didn't lower his gun. "This isn't how it's supposed to be," Emily shouted her words in the night sky, but it didn't make a difference. Mr. Griswold's game was over. He was still in critical condition. It didn't matter if the prize had been a valuable manuscript or $1 million or a stuffed walrus. Mr. Griswold might die, and the book Scavenger might die with him. Nothing would change any of that. James and Matthew stood beside her, and Matthew placed a hand on her shoulder. Emily leveled her eyes at the three men. "You're pathetic." "He shot him, not me," Mr. Romero pointed to Clyde. "But it had to be done. I certainly couldn't go publicizing that Poe's manuscript if Griswold's still around. As it stands now, nobody knows it exists. It can be my discovery." "Well," Mr. Romero rumpled his hair and looked suddenly uncomfortable. "Nobody knows it exists other than you three." Out of the darkness behind Clyde, a voice growled, "Make that 4." There was a large whack, and Clyde dropped to his knees. The gun flew out of Clyde's hands and skidded across the concrete. Mr. Romero dropped to a crouch, covering his head, and peeked up, scanning the ground. "There," Matthew pointed his flush poster at the gun, and James ran to retrieve it. Unfortunately, Barry did too and got to the gun first. Clyde's attacker stepped under a lamppost, bending over Clyde to make sure he was knocked out. The dreadlocks would have been recognizable anyways. "Hollister," Emily said. "I hoped I'd see you kids here, but not under these circumstances," Hollister said. Emily didn't have time to dwell on all the questions Hollister's presence raised. Barry swung the gun back and forth. "Don't just stand there, idiot. Do something," Mr. Romero said. "What am I supposed to do?" Barry shouted. "You're supposed to get me that manuscript by any means possible," Mr. Romero said. Mr. Romero jabbed a finger at Emily's direction, punctuating every word. "Get me that manuscript." Hollister remained crouched next to the unconscious Clyde. He used one hand to clamp together Clyde's limp wrists, while with the other he dug into his own pocket. "Leon, get a hold of yourself," Hollister said. "You stay out of this." Mr. Romero didn't even look Hollister's way. "Hand me the gun, Barry." "They're just kids," Barry said. "Don't let him talk to you like that," Matthew piped up. Barry swung the gun towards Matthew. Emily pressed the manuscript even more tightly to her chest. "He's using you, man," Matthew said. "He doesn't care about you. All he cares about is getting some stupid old manuscript." "Is that all you care about?" Barry swung his gun back to Romero. "Barry," Romero said in a calm, even voice, "that's not true. You're my flesh and blood. Give me the gun and I'll pay you double. How much is he paying you? James says. $500, Barry muttered. That's all? Matthew said. You know he's going to make bank on that musty old stack of papers my sister's holding, right? He wouldn't have gone to all this trouble if he was only going to make a couple $1,000s. Don't listen to him, Romero said. He's just a kid. But what Matthew had said sunk in. You don't care about me, Barry said. All you care about are books. Faintly in the distance, Emily heard the wail of sirens. I called the police, Hollister removed his hand from his pocket and revealed a lit-up phone. They'll be here any minute. Good, Barry muttered, his gun trained on Romero. I'm sick of this gig. Chapter 40. Emily, James, and Matthew sat under the Bacota's awning with Hollister. They'd given their report to the police, who were now finishing dealing with Barry, Clyde, and Romero. At the moment, Mr. Romero knelt on the grass and wailed, I had no choice. Griswold had no respect for literary treasures. He was a savage. He buried that manuscript in the ground. It's probably not even in an acid-free container. As they waited for an officer to escort them home, Emily finally had a chance to ask Hollister why he was there. Hollister hunched his shoulders, his dreadlocks draped forward over his shoulder. It wasn't until the yelling got going that I woke up. He had been in the sleeping bag that we had spotted when they first arrived at Portsmouth Square. He seemed more shaken from everything that had happened than Emily, James, and Matthew were. I'm sorry I didn't get to you kids before. Things could have gone much worse than they did. It's okay, Hollister. James patted him on the back. We're all fine now. Do you always sleep here? Emily said. Fairly often. Ever since you brought that book in my shop, actually. The gold bug? Emily asked. Did you know about the game? You knew it ended here? Yes and no, Hollister said. You see, as I told you before, Gary and I go way back. Decades ago, there was a treasure hunt revolving around a picture book called The Masquerade. It became quite the phenomenon, and Gary was inspired. This was 40 years ago, but even that far back, he planned on starting his game with the gold bug and ending it right here with a nod to Robert Louis Stevenson. Those were the pieces of his plan that I knew. So when I saw your copy of the gold bug, I recognized Gary's handiwork. I figured he'd decided the time had come to put the game in motion. I didn't know about the manuscript, and it didn't sound like he knew about that himself until more recently. But it doesn't surprise me. I knew he wanted to give away something big, something that would get people talking. I decided to keep an eye on this place. Honestly, I've been trying to figure out where he hid the treasure myself, so it wouldn't end up in the wrong hands. Hollister nodded towards Romero, Barry, and Clyde to indicate the type of wrong hands he was talking about. I have to apologize to you kids, Hollister said. I thought this would be a harmless game. I didn't realize that Mr. Romero or anyone else was involved. Not that I would have expected this from Leon. He's a prickly fellow, but I never would have guessed downright rotten. I wouldn't have sat by and watched you kids play if I thought you were walking into trouble. But Gary would be tickled to know you were the ones who solved his game. You get what he was all about. You understand the spirit of the game and have true love for books. That's Gary. Before school the next morning, Emily walked into the kitchen to face her parents for the first time since seeing their pale, shocked faces when police officers had knocked on their door with her and Matthew in tow. She felt miserable for storming out the way she had. She knew her parents must have thought she overreacted to their news. She already knew what they'd say about that. We have plenty of time left in San Francisco, but however long they had left could never feel like enough. 6 months, 9 months, a year. It never felt like enough time when you knew you'd be saying your goodbyes soon. And how do you open yourself up to hellos when you've already prepared to say goodbye? Her mom and dad sat at the kitchen table with family albums open in front of them. They were looking at a spread of pictures from a day spent in Estes Park in Colorado. "Remember this, Em?" her dad asked. A herd of elk had walked down the mountain road into the main street in the village, meandering past stores as if they were souvenir shopping. "So many good memories," her mom said. "Only in Colorado," her dad said. Emily knew where this was going. All the experiences and adventures they gained from different states they lived in, and how lucky she was. How other kids memorized state capitals from a map while she visited them in person. Or how she walked around Mount Rushmore instead of only reading about it. Or how she recited the Gettysburg Address from Cemetery Hill, where President Lincoln gave the speech himself. Her dad cleared his throat. "We didn't finish our conversation last night." "I already apologized," she said. Mom flipped to another page of the album. "Well, we feel like we owe you this one too." "You do?" "The lifestyle we've created for our family. Your mom and I know it's unconventional. That's part of what appeals to us about it. And we feel like you and your brother are getting a type of education that can't be bought or found by attending the same school year after year." "I know," Emily said. So far, she was missing the apology part of her parents' apology. "We realize that we've been a bit selfish," her mom said. "You and Matthew are getting older. You're developing your own independent dreams and aspirations, and they may not sync with ours. Last night made us realize that we want the whole family on board for our next move. You know, we love our surprises, but it never occurred to us what kind of stress that might cause for you, not knowing when or where we might move next. So we'll stay in San Francisco indefinitely and make the decision to move on as a family when we're all ready, whether it's a year from now or 5. "Seriously? What about your book deal?" "What about it?" her mom said. "Your book is about living in all 50 states. We have a lot more to go before we're done. If we stop now, you won't be able to write your book." "Our book is about our quest to live in 50 states. We have plenty of material to work with." "You mean we're not moving again?" Her dad stood up from the table and swung an arm around her shoulder. "We'll keep it open for family discussions, but for now, we'll call San Francisco our home for as long as you and Matthew want it to be. Once you guys go to college, your mom and I can resume our nomadic ways." Emily put one arm around her dad's waist and the other around her mom, still seated at the table, and brought them together in a big group hug. "You guys are the best," she said. Chapter 41. 1 week later, Emily and James returned to the Bayside Press Building, this time with Matthew in tow, to meet with Mr. Griswold's associate, Jack, and discuss their prize for winning Mr. Griswold's scavenger hunt. The Poe manuscript had been turned over to the police at Portsmouth Square, and Emily had no idea what to expect from this meeting. She knew she should be excited. She'd daydream of playing a Griswold game, let alone winning one. But she felt deflated about the whole thing ever since the run-in with Mr. Romero. The elevator doors opened to the wine and silver blue lobby. "Did a giant barf cotton candy in here, or what?" Matthew said. Jack leaned against the receptionist's desk waiting for them. Just like the first time they met, he was wearing an argyle sweater vest. Jack greeted Emily and James with hugs and handshakes, and a handshake from Matthew. "Follow me," said Jack, ushering them down the hall. "He's eager to talk to you." "Who is?" Emily asked. Jack stopped in front of a set of double doors. It had only just registered that this was Mr. Griswold's office, where Jack had pushed the doors open, and there was Mr. Griswold himself. He sat in a wheelchair, striped in Bayside press colors, and admired the golden hair medallion still on display around the bust of Poe. Was she hallucinating? "No way," James said. "Old book dude," Matthew called out. Emily slugged her brother, then fiddled with the pencil in her ponytail. Her palms felt sweaty, and she wiped them on her jeans. Mr. Griswold wheeled himself closer and smiled, his bushy mustache lifting up at the ends. He looked exactly like his photo in the newspaper clipping, but less gray. "You must be Emily, James, and Matthew. A pleasure to meet you three. Emily, I understand you have been a loyal book Scavenger user for years." "You're not in a coma?" Emily blurted, then mentally slugged herself. She daydreamed about this moment forever, and that was how she greeted her idol. Mr. Griswold chuckled. Come in, he said. Wheeled back and gestured to the couch, nestled between bookcases. "We have a lot of catching up to do, don't we?" As Emily, James, and Matthew seated themselves in Mr. Griswold's office, Jack perched on the arm of the couch and launched into an explanation. The police suspected from the beginning that the BART station attack was premeditated, he said, largely because none of Mr. Griswold's personal belongings were stolen. Except one important thing, Mr. Griswold added with a wink. While Mr. Griswold had been in a coma, there had been a security breach at the hospital, and people feared that his life was still at risk, so he had been secretly relocated. Hospital staff noticed that he was missing, and a rumor spread that he had died, which his team decided not to address until his health stabilized. Hearing this, Emily realized the book scavenger user, Captain Overpants, the one who claimed to work at Mr. Griswold's hospital, hadn't been making up the rumor he gossiped about. "I remember encountering these two men in the BART station, and then the next thing I know, I'm waking up a month later in a strange place with an incredible headache and no recollection of how I got there, or any awareness of how much time had passed. Jack had been filling me in on all that happened, and boy, has a lot transpired." Mr. Griswold even eyes crinkled with kindness as his gaze settled on Emily. "I'm setting the record straight about my, vitality this afternoon, but after all you've been through, I wanted you to hear the news directly from me." Emily's mouth hung open. She wasn't sure if she closed it once or even taken a breath the entire time Mr. Griswold and Jack had been talking. A mixture of relief and awe swirled inside as she proceeded with Mr. Griswold, as she processed that Mr. Griswold was sitting right in front of her. It all seemed a bit dreamlike. "I hope you enjoyed my literary treasure hunt, despite Mr. Romero's antics," he said. "We did," Emily said, her voice near a whisper. She swallowed and repeated herself more loudly. Mr. Griswold clapped his hands in his lap, studying the Poe bust as he talked. "Ever since I learned about my relation to Rufus Griswold and the role he played in Poe's life, I have felt remorse for how my ancestor treated Poe after he died. You see, Rufus took advantage of his position as a Poe literary executioner. He altered some of Poe's letters and writings and compiled them into a biography in an attempt to paint Post in a very negative light." "Why would he do that?" James asked. Griswold shook his head. "I'm not sure anyone knows. Rufus' lies and fabrications weren't fully revealed until long after his own death, so he never had to explain himself. He and Poe had a contentious relationship, to be sure. Towards the end of Poe's life, there was a woman they were both friends with, and so some speculate there was a love triangle in play. Griswold shook his head once again. I don't know the why, but to go out of your way to spread lies about someone after they passed away, well, I can only imagine what a sad, bitter man my great-great-great-grandfather must have been. Griswold dragged a finger across the charms that dangled from the golden hair medallion. When I discovered the Poe manuscript, an idea clicked for me. I had long been a fan of Poe's short story, The Gold Bug, and thought it would be fun to emulate the treasure hunt. Once I found the manuscript, I realized I not only had the perfect prize in hand, but I could make amends to the ghost of Poe at the same time. Something had been bothering Emily for the last week was nudging free as she listened to Mr. Griswold talk. What about Mr. Romero? Griswold sighed sadly. Yes, Mr. Romero. I am so sorry about Leon. I had no idea he could be capable of such awfulness. He grimaced, his mustache folded into deep lines on his face. He knows books and literary history incredibly well. I always forget that not all book people are good people. Emily tilted her head, surprised to hear that. Hollister had said nearly the same thing a couple weeks ago. Mr. Griswold continued, I feel like I should have known or seen red flags, but when I have a game in works, I can get obsessed, Jack offered. Griswold smiled. I was going to say hyper-focused. I get so intent on orchestrating my plans and keeping them a secret that I suppose I have a tendency to stop observing what's really going on around me. Like losing yourself in a jam, Matthew said. Exactly. Mr. Griswold punctuated the word with the tap of his finger against his wheelchair arm. Emily still wasn't completely satisfied. Mr. Romero said that he found the Poe manuscript. He said that he deserved to be partners with you 50-50. Technically, he did find the manuscript. I suppose that part's true. I hired him to sort through and archive my family's papers and heirlooms, in addition to helping me with my book collection. I never expected to uncover a Poe manuscript, of course, but I knew there were some potentially valuable or historical interesting items. I even had Mr. Romero sign a non-disclosure statement to assert that he would not divulge information he learned or claimed ownership of anything in my possession. Not to mention, I compensated him for his work. Compensated him very well, in fact, but I don't think it was the money that ultimately mattered to him. I think it was the glory of discovering a lost Poe. And you and I would understand a bit of that, wouldn't we, Emily? The thrill and satisfaction of a treasure hunt. It's what Book Scavenger is all about. Not all about, she said. It's about a community of book lovers and sharing books and adventures with friends. Her eyes flicked to James, and she felt shy all of a sudden. But he was smiling. Matthew elbowed her. And brothers. I think Mr. Romero knew that with me involved, he'd only be a footnote in the story. Without me, he could orchestrate a different scene for himself to discover the work, thereby ensuring the spotlight would shine fully on him. Emily had told herself she didn't believe Mr. Romero's claims about Mr. Griswold, but it wasn't until right now, hearing Mr. Griswold explain his side in person, that the weight of those negative words truly evaporated. There's something I still haven't figured out, James said. If you were really unconscious that whole time, then who was Raven? Was it Jack? Jack pointed himself. Me? I've never even heard of Raven. Mr. Griswold chuckled. Raven is right here. He wheeled himself towards a bookcase that opened to reveal a small room filled with computer equipment. This is Raven, my virtual assistant. She's a computer program designed to assist players in the scavenger hunt. I knew it, James said with a triumphant fist. I knew there was something weird about her. But why did you activate Raven if you weren't planning to start the game right away? The simple answer is, I wanted to cross it off my to-do list. Sounds silly, doesn't it? Raven was programmed to reply to users' queries only if they used the trigger phrase, the gold bug. Once you made that initial contact with Raven, she could respond to other questions, but she wouldn't interact with you without the first gold bug prompt. And so, because of that, and because nobody had ever posted about the gold bug in the history of Book Scavenger, I activated Raven. I didn't anticipate it being a possibility that Raven would be put to work because I wasn't planning to hide any copies of the gold bug until right before the game. And so everything Raven told us was pre-programmed. Yes, Mr. Griswold said, she was set up to give specific clues or bits of information if someone used the right prompts. That's why she kept saying the same thing over and over whenever we wrote the gold bug. So why didn't she always reply? Emily said, thinking about the time she'd seen Raven's green light, online light, but didn't receive a response to her message. I programmed Raven to answer 8 inquiries from a user at a time. If you used up all 8, then Raven wouldn't respond to you for another 48 hours. Just my attempt to be a little trickery. Mr. Griswold cleared his throat. Now it's time for us to get to do some fun stuff. Your prizes. Mr. Griswold explained that while the original Poe manuscript would be sent to a university collection where it would be displayed in an exhibit and studied by scholars, Bayside Press would be publishing a copy of Poe's novel. Emily, James, and Matthew would split 10% of the royalties earned from the sale of the book to be deposited into a scholarship fund for each of them. In addition, they were each gifted a laptop and invited to be founding members of a teen advisory board for the Book Scavenger website. I have one more token of appreciation in mind, but for now, I'll keep that secret, Mr. Griswold said. You know, there was someone else who helped us, too. Emily spoke up a bit shyly. She wasn't sure how Mr. Griswold would react to this, but she felt compelled to bring it up anyways. I think he's an old friend of yours, Hollister. The corner of Mr. Griswold's mouth twitched as an unreadable emotion briefly waved across his face. Ah, Hollister, Mr. Griswold said softly. We haven't spoken in ages, I'm afraid. Well, it's never too late to reach out to someone. That's what he told me, actually. Mr. Griswold smiled. Did he now? That's sound advice. Very sound advice indeed. Okay, we're going to go a little over because we have one more chapter. Chapter 42. Emily lay on her bed, finishing a book James had lent her called Rhyme Schemer. They planned to hide it at Pier 39 that evening when they went with her family to the lighted boat parade. There was a knock on her door and her dad opened it, letting in the sounds of Flush Holiday album Matthew had been making the family listen to on repeat since Thanksgiving. A package for you, her dad said, raising a medium-sized cardboard box. Emily jumped up and grabbed it. The Bayside Press logo was stamped on top. They're here, she squealed. Mr. Griswold had said he was sending her advanced copies of the new Poe novel. His final prize to her, James, and Matthew would be inside the book. I have to tell James. She put the box down and raced to her window. A colorful strain of holiday bulbs around her window reflected off the rain-flecked glass. She moved the antlers, the gold bug, and the raven box from the windowsill to the floor before sliding the window up and reaching for the pulley. Now sleep with rain. Her dad chuckled and left, letting the door close behind him. Once the bucket was at her level, she grabbed the notebook and scratched out a message. The books are here, come over. The next 15 minutes seemed like the longest minutes ever as she waited for James to come down. She finished Rhyme Schemer and then paced her room until he poked his head in. Finally, Emily clapped her hands. James held up a thin paper bag with a logo on it for sourdough bread. I thought of a good book. The clue can be something about lost bread or a book that wants to be edible. He snapped his fingers and an idea occurred to him. We'll make up the clue using altered poetry, like the character does in Rhyme Schemer. Emily grinned. Yes, 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 brilliant. But first, look. She dragged a ballpoint pen across the tape sealing the Bayside Press book. The flap propped open to reveal paperback books of the Cathedral Murders by Edgar Allan Poe. They weren't the final books, but Jack had said these advanced copies would be like a dress rehearsal before the official performance. Emily removed a copy and squeezed it between her hands, breathing in the paper smell. She flipped through the pages, wondering if the last page would be another hidden puzzle. It wasn't. It was a special mention in the introductory of the book. One fall day, Emily Crane, James Lee, two San Francisco middle school students, found what they thought was an innocuous copy of Edgar Allan Poe's book, abandoned at a BART station. Little did they know that this book, a reprinting of Poe's story, The Gold Bug, would leave them on a wild scavenger hunt across San Francisco, culminating in the discovery of the manuscript for the very novel you hold in your hands. The introduction went on to tell the story of Mr. Griswold's plan for the game and how Emily and James unraveled all the clues. I can't believe it. We're in the book, Emily exclaimed. We're famous book hunters, James said. They spent a few quiet minutes looking through their copies of the new Poe book till Matthew poked his head in. His lopsided mohawk had been shaved away, leaving short, stubby hair everywhere except for his long bangs. Dad says the books are here? Emily held one out to him. Page 5, she said. After skimming the introductions, Matthew said, There's nothing in here about my awesome kung fu moves to stop Mr. Remora. That's because that only happened in your dreams, Emily said. Oh, right. Matthew flicked his bangs out of his eyes and smiled. But you did get a mention for the Maltese Falcon clue, and of course, Portsmouth Square. Matthew pointed to the bread bag on the floor. What's the bread for? He asked. James slid Rhymer Schemer inside the bag. It's a book. Matthew made a face and shook his head. No, no, no. If you're going to dress a book up like a sourdough loaf, you need to make it more convincing than that. Hold on. Matthew left the room, and James turned the wrapped book this way and that. I guess it does look like a book in a paper bag. When Matthew returned, he carried a roll of toilet paper and sheets of newspaper. He crumpled up a sheet of newspaper with one hand and gestured for the book. You put the paper on top to add bulk, like a real sourdough loaf. Now, mummify them together so they stay in the same place. James wound the toilet paper around the book as Matthew held it and the balled-up paper in place. Emily opened the sourdough bag to check for size. "Squish it down more so it'll fit," she said. Emily smiled at the heads of her brother and James, bent together in concentration. When they finished stuffing the bread bag, Emily held up the concealed book, twisted it to view from all angles. "Now that's a book," Matthew said. From the hallway, Emily's mom called, "Time to head out, everybody." "Let's go hide it," James said. "You ready, Em?" "I'm ready." And she was. She was ready to lean into their next adventure. The end. Good job, Mr. Hammond's class. We finally finished this book. I have something new for you tomorrow.